Pain. Pain can turn each of us into theologians. That's right. Some of the most debilitating pain I have ever experienced was in the isolating depths of depression, which, like this very thick fog, has rolled over and settled into my life a few times. In its most recent season, that hazy melancholy brought me to this unsettling and humbling learning that all human beings are limited and dependent to certain degrees, be it intellectual, spiritual, physical, or emotional. And at that time, bumping up into my own embodied limits was a real challenge for me, because it didn't feel so complementary with our faith. You see, I was drawn to Unitarian Universalism because of its do-gooder optimism, the kind that blazes forward to push the boundaries of what we can do as a faith community. You know what I'm talking about. It's the one that is relentlessly committed to making progress for justice and birth transformative love. But in the down-spiritedness of my depression waves, I found myself in a moral and theological struggle with my own limits. I was unable to push through. Sometimes I didn't have the energy to sing my most favorite hymns, and I certainly did not have any capacity to answer the call to get out there and do some justice making. I needed spiritual resourcing, ones that could honor my disabled embodiment as a person suffering with hard, difficult mental illness. So like any good UU, I went searching and on a hunt for that free, responsible search for truth and meaning. On this hunt, I searched for theologies, ones that could educate my heart to not just pursue my potential, but also to embrace my limits. I longed for theologies that would not deny or depreciate my own limits or the limits of others. That's when I found it, the limits model. The limits model comes from a feminist theologian named Deb Creamer, and it is one of those theologies that I very much needed to scaffold and mature my faith. As an embodied theology of disability, limit theology takes very seriously the body, each of our bodies, as a primary source for spiritual enrichment and meaning-making. Limit theology attends to human diversity by recognizing just how common and unsurprising limits are. Instead of viewing disability as an exception to the, quote, norm, it takes the position that to be disabled is actually our most normal state of embodiness. That disability is just an expression of human limits, which is an intrinsic aspect of being human. That each one of us is limited to varying degrees, and to be, quote, healthy is a temporary, transient state. And while each one of us has limits, our limitations do differ and can be quite complicated. In this world, some of our limitations are accepted, others are rejected. Some limitations are degraded, and others can be accentuated. It's when we don't deny the normality of limits in our lives that we start to dismiss disability as an othering experience. You see, beloveds, when limits are understood to be an important part of what it means to be human and what it means to live in meaningful community with one another, all of those dualistic categories of us versus them, of abled and disabled, begin to lose its hierarchical, oppressive power. And in that opening space, a wider conversation can emerge, one about embodiment and one about difference. These are the conversations I believe we need to be having, the conversations that invite our imaginations to expand beyond this false normative individual body and invite us back into radical, interdependent bodies. You see, understood as a fluid experience, disability is no longer an either-or. It is instead more of a when, a where, and a how. Be it aging, be it experiencing the impact of the climate crisis on one's health during a season of fire and smoke. Maybe it's an arthritis flare-up, having to adjust to medical footwear from a sports injury. Sometimes it's going through cancer or serious illness. Sometimes it's experiencing a distressing trauma response or mental health challenge. Sometimes it's that feeling of entering a new season of sobriety. And sometimes it's discovering new skills for a neurodivergent brain. You see, each of us are limited in our own unique ways. And it's when we dare to embrace our limits and the unique fluidity of them in our lives that a whole new world of theological reflection can open up. This is the world of faithfully honoring our limits for interdependence. And I think this is a really important theological intervention for us UUs. You see, as a faith tradition, we've inherited universal theologies, the ones that offer us a common destiny. In its earliest expressions, universalism developed in the Christian tradition, and it was radical for its inclusive position that everybody was saved. No one was eternally damned. And that universalism feels really good to me. It feels good because it rejects those theologies that fit people into two separate categories, the sheep and the goats, the saved and the damned. And today we see universalism as a modern philosophy and a scientific adventure, one that seeks to bring people together by producing scientific knowledge that we hope can be universally true. And again, I really like these universalist concepts because they make me feel safe and in control. But when my own mental health challenges brought me outside of that norm, and I could no longer assimilate into the wider universal whole, those forms of universalism were too theologically shallow for me. We are not all the same. And universal inclusion does not always lead to justice if what is universal is a prescribed, quote, norm. Without a limit, our universalist theologies can cause harm because they tend to perpetuate the status quo, imposing norms of a dominant culture on us all. These norms are so obvious and harming when you find yourself on the margins. This is one reason why liberation theologians, like disability justice activists, challenge the viability of universal theologies, arguing that, wait a minute, experiences of difference are just as valid and just as valued. So what does this mean? What does it mean if we can no longer rely on assumptions of universality to collectively make us all free? For me, it's right here. It's in that intersection between disability and theology where I matured my faith, where I was able to mature my faith from being a liberal tradition to a liberatory one. When we embrace our limits, we start being honest about our unique needs. And then we start committing ourselves to what disability justice activist Mia Mingus calls access intimacy. Interdependency in action is access intimacy. It's what happens when each one of us does the shared labor of love to cultivate relationships of mutuality and care. It's what happens when we shift our work from meeting the needs of an individual responsibility to being a collective responsibility. It's when we remember that access is a collective, interdependent process. But this, beloveds, is some risky business. It's risky because it demands that we shift our notions of what we think is, quote, normal. It's risky because it invites us into being more vulnerable, to share our needs and listen to the needs of others. It's an invitation. Honoring our limits is an invitation to live lives of interdependence. These are the practices we need to create the world that we all long for, the world where we care about one another and tend to our needs. In the current chapter of Northlake's story, I hear some pain and frustration. I hear this pain and frustration about the life of the congregation, the collective whole bumping up into its own limitations. There is grief and confusion and sadness for a wide range of factors, this faith community's capacity has shifted. I hear this pain in your burnout and your exhaustion. I hear this pain in your struggle to get volunteers and filling elected positions. I hear this pain in the sadness of having less families and less children around. I hear this pain in our aging members' worry about their place here and their wonderings about who is going to do this work for the next generation. I hear this pain in the nostalgia of what Northlake used to feel like, used to be like back in the day, or before COVID, or before some other milestone in your church's history. But remember, beloveds, pain can turn each of us into theologians. So I'm wondering what embodied theologies this church community can discover when we don't just accept, but embrace our own limitness. What shifts can happen when we do not fear, seek to overcome, or deny the limits of our larger church life? I suspect new questions would emerge, questions about one another's needs, and then moving towards one another with compassion, respect, and mutuality. So I ask you this, in your own life, be it here at Northlake and outside its sanctuary walls, where are you being called to faithfully honor your limits? Where are you being called into an invitation of intimacy in the form of interdependency? In my personal story, It was embracing my own limitness, not a false sense of do-gooder optimistic limitlessness that matured my UUism. Because the last time those dark, dreary skies of depression clouded over and shrunk my capacity, that's when I learned that to be a UU was not just about living up to my potential, it was also about living within my limits. Limits that invited me into more compassion, more honesty, more real, vulnerable relationships, both with myself and with others around me. Faithfully honoring my limits was an invitation to live into interdependence. And that, my beloveds, was not only liberating, it was also life-saving.